Well, good morning, everybody. I thought as my first sermon I should choose a couple of passages that kind of, in a way, sum up what I'm all about. So I'm not quite sure where to start, historically or with the passages. Let's start with that first passage. Mark 14. Jesus says to the woman who anoints him with oil, "Wherever the gospel is told, tell her story in remembrance, not of me," which is what we normally expect that phrase to end, in remembrance of her. I don't know how many times when you've told people the story of Jesus or had the story of Jesus told to you, she has been the first other character in the story other than Jesus that people have told you about. Not very often, I would imagine. But she's the only person in the Gospels that Jesus tells us specifically, or the writer of Mark tells us specifically, however we hear that passage, that we are told specifically their story should be told whenever we are talking about Jesus. And I chose that partly because one of the things I'm kind of all about is going, do you know what? Women are massively underrepresented in the Bible, in the whole patriarchy, and yet their stories are there. And part of what our task is simply to notice them and to tell them and to learn from them. I was giving a talk yesterday about how we could rescue the Bible from patriarchy, which I'm not going to do now because it was an hour's talk. But these women are not in here by accident. The Bible was written in an incredibly patriarchal society where even the very language excluded women. If there was a mixed group like this, you would talk about there being 50 men here because the male pronoun included the female, a bit like people say, oh, well, we don't need to change the language of the Book of Common Prayer because mankind clearly includes women. So women are systematically excluded, which means that when they are mentioned like this, they must be incredibly important. Those stories are not just kind of accidentally there because there happened to be a woman in the background, so someone thought they'd better mention her. Generally, that didn't happen. So we should really look and study at these stories. And I suppose in a way, one of the reasons I wanted to say that was because it says quite a lot about how I approach the Bible, which I thought might be one of the things that you were a bit worried about, concerned about your new vicar. What does she think of the Bible? Is she going to come and rant at us about it? Well, I come at the Bible in my own particular way, as we all do. And I suppose the first thing to say is that my training was as a historian first. I did a history degree, and I wasn't a Christian when I started the degree. I was by the end of it. Might come on to that. I did a history degree. I did a history PhD. I taught history for a bit. And it was in the middle of doing a history degree that I became a Christian. And I think that's quite important in kind of understanding where I'm coming from when I read things like the Bible, because I see it primarily as a historical text. Now, because I'm a historian, that's quite a nuanced view. That doesn't mean I think all of this actually happened. Obviously not. Nothing that I look at as a historical text is an accurate record of what actually happened. Everything that is written at any point in the past is one person's reflection of what actually happened, or of what they want people who read that to think actually happened. So I tend to bring all that, why was this written? Who wrote this? Why were they writing it? Why has someone later chosen to include it into whatever I look at the biblical texts? Which you can give all sorts of fancy names if you want to. But that's the first thing I do is I look at it as a kind of professional historian, going, this is really interesting evidence. And often what it's evidence for, what I'm more interested in it being evidence for, is what people at the society thought was going on and what they wanted you to think, rather than necessarily anything that actually happened at the time. Although obviously things at the time did happen. And the second thing that I bring to it is, I suppose, my own conversion story, if you like, my testimony, if you want the evangelical phrase, which I will generally avoid because I'm not evangelical at all. But I became a Christian at university. And I was really annoyed to become a Christian at university. Because when you're at university and the Christian Union is there and they're kind of inviting you to their very earnest pancakes and Jesus events and so on. PJ's pissing herself laughing now. The last thing you want as a kind of normal member of society is to be thought to be one of them. So I wasn't. I was very clear I wasn't. I had friends who were Christians who went to the college chapel and occasionally took me along to college chapel. And the short summary of my conversion story is kind of, I suppose, 3 stages maybe. The first stage was realising that not all Christians were stupid. As a very arrogant teenager, I'd assumed that Christians were idiots and that clearly intelligent people like me knew that this was rubbish. And then I started studying history, at which point, of course, virtually everybody that you're reading, particularly when you start reading the history of philosophy and so on, which is one of my great interests, a lot of these people, really intelligent, writing fantastic books, also believed in most of this stuff. And you think, So first of all, they're not all idiots for that. Secondly, I'm meeting people who are just as intelligent and doing chemistry degrees or history degrees or Latin degrees or whatever, or mathematics degrees, who happen to be Christians. So that this needs taking a bit more seriously. And then I was taken along to college chapel. So at this point, I knew very little about Christianity. I'd gone to Sunday school as a child. So I knew the story of Moses and the bulrushes, which I'll come on to. You might have to stop me at some point. So, I knew the stories like that you get taught at Sunday school. I knew those quite well. So I knew about Christianity. But I got taken to college chapel. I didn't really know English services apart from going to Girl Guide services occasionally where it kind of washes over you and you're not really listening. So I'd never been to a service of choral evensong, which I have to say is not really my favourite service in the world. But I was blown away by it the first time I went. As a keen young undergraduate, put your gown on. This is quite fun. You get to put your gown on and you go to college chapel and then you have dinner afterwards in the Great Hall. This is quite fun. So I went along and they sang the Magnificat, Mary's song, which I now know that is sung at every evensong. I didn't know that at the time. And I've since heard it sung in all sorts of Latin versions and so on. I was a college chaplain for years. But that time they sang it in English in an absolutely hauntingly beautiful version. And I don't think I'd ever heard the words before, or certainly not heard them. And they were singing about casting down the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. And I thought, gosh, is that what Christians believe? I'd got no idea. I wasn't converted by hearing the Magnificat, but to me that was the first bit of Christianity that I really knew and thought was important. It was years later I went to theological college and realised, no, that isn't what most Christians believe at all. So part of my mission is to go, well, actually, that I still think is actually what we're all about. That kind of radical edge of this excluded woman saying, do you know what, we're going to change the bloody world. That's a large part of what I'm about. And then I had what at the time I was so embarrassed about, this conversion experience. I was in a group of friends. Those of you who've been at university or remember what it's like or have children at university will know how intense a bubble it is of, people not speaking to each other, and anything that happens at university seems incredibly important. So there was this situation of a group of friends, and I cannot remember the details, but somebody wasn't speaking to someone else, and someone else had just split up with someone else, and someone was about to kill themselves or was going around threatening people with knives. It was a horrible situation which seemed totally untangleable. And I was lying on my bed one night praying a classic atheist's prayer, which was totally incoherent. So apologies for how incoherent this was. I lay there and said something like, "Dear God, if you existed, which you don't, but if you did, you could sort this out, I hope. And some of the people involved are Christians, so maybe you exist for them. That doesn't make sense." I mean, I was literally doing a little critique of what I was saying at the same time. And I suddenly had this experience of God's presence, which I have to say my initial response to was to go, oh, shit. I don't know how long it lasted, about half an hour I think. I just lay there and God was there, and it was as if we were just face to face. And there were no words, and there was certainly no expression. People have asked me since what kind of expression was going on. I didn't actually see a face, obviously, but it was as if you know someone's there in front of you. Or the closest I can come to describing it is that I was just being lovingly regarded. It was amazing, and it totally changed my life. And I went, because I'm a very academic person, my response the next morning, well, first of all, my response the next morning was to go, oh, thank goodness, I got to sleep after that. That was weird, clearly rubbish. And just at that, or was it rubbish, I'm not sure, just at that point there was a knock on my door, and this girl who we all thought was either going to kill herself or stab various people at the time, knocked on my door and said, hi, I've been making a lot of fuss about nothing, haven't I? Should we go out for breakfast? I remember literally looking up and going, oh God, you do exist. So, having sorted her out, I went and knocked on the college chaplain door. I was very lucky in my college chaplain at that point. If any of you know the church thing, it was Martin Percy, who's now Dean of Christ Church. So this was the right person to go to at this point. So I went and knocked on the college chaplain's door and said, I need a reading list. And bless him, he gave me a reading list. He didn't try and preach at me, he just gave me a list of books to go and read. And because I was a tight student and had no money, I went and sat on the floor of Heffer's bookshop and read them. What do you recommend? I can't remember. There was one there's one that I can remember. The first line was about creation, and it said, God was throwing a party, which is an image that has always stayed with me, that the whole point of people being created was God just wanted this great party to enter into the life of the Trinity. The other book that I can remember reading, I can't remember whether he recommended it or whether I just found it on the Heffer's bookshelf, because you know what it's like. Well, if you're like me, you do. You sit there reading through it, and then you just kind of start reading everything else that's next to it on the shelf. The book that I actually ended up buying and taking home and reading was by Richard Holloway, called Dancing on the Edge, all about how truth is found in that teetering knife edge between paradox, and it's going to be wrong or heresy or whatever if you fall down on either side. But if you can keep balancing on that knife edge between one thing and two things which are both not true, but somehow in the gap between them there's the truth. I loved that. So I thought that liberal progressive Christianity was what everyone thought. I thought this was the deal. As I say, then later on I ended up... and the next stage, I suppose, was I could not get my head around Jesus' divinity and humanity at the same time. I couldn't get my head around the incarnation. And because I was very academic, I was really puzzling about this. I didn't write any blooming essays that term. I was just reading up on Christianity. And I was walking along one day on my way to a lecture, going, How could Jesus be both fully divine and fully human? You can't be fully one thing and fully another thing. It doesn't make sense. And I suddenly stopped and thought, hang on, of course, this sounds really naff, but of course I can't understand it, because we're talking about something finite, trying to comprehend something infinite. It's like trying to understand the concept of infinity or something. Actually, if I could understand it, it wouldn't be God that I was understanding. And I thought, oh, that's all right then. I suppose I'm a Christian then. And later, one of the books that Martin recommended was C.S. Lewis's autobiography. And I really resonated with the line where he says he became a Christian on the top of a bus after a very similar conversation with himself, and went on his way the most dejected convert in all England. Because I was really worried that people were going to think I was one of them. So that's kind of me. So I'm going to come back to the Moses story now. Haven't been timing myself. So the Moses story I chose partly because it's got all those fantastic women in, but partly because it's one of those stories that I did know before I became a Christian. It's a classic story, Moses, the baby and the bulrushes. And it's only when you look at it again, with your consciousness raised as a feminist or liberation theologian or whatever spectacles you've got, that you realise this isn't really a story about the baby. It's a story about all those fantastic, rebellious women and what they do. And we're always told it as this miraculous infancy narrative of Moses, the great hero, who is about, this is the beginning of Exodus, he's about to lead the people out from freedom, slavery to freedom in the promised land. And we do have this tendency as a church to focus on the great heroic narratives. First it's Moses, then it's Jesus, then it's Peter or Paul or whatever. And actually that's really quite unhelpful, because we can end up, bit of a feminist fairy tale critique here, we can end up expecting ourselves to be a bit like Cinderella and wait for some hero to come and ride to the rescue. That's the problem with a lot of those kind of Jesus is my boyfriend type songs, isn't it? You know, it's the kind of, we're sitting here totally helpless and we need somebody to come along and ride to our rescue on a white charger and rescue us from everything, rather than taking some responsibility for ourselves, which is a sneaky way of getting in. Please don't expect me as the new vicar to be the Messiah figure who is riding in and is going to save everything. That is definitely not my theology of what a vicar is. We're all in this together. And I see myself as having a kind of chairmanship role. I mean, yes, you know, there's a priestly role, but I'm not your saviour, okay? I'm not Moses. But I'd love to be one of these women in this story. They're great. And I just want to go through them, and this is often how I tend to approach biblical texts. Actually, let's look at some of these people who we often don't focus on, because we focus on the great hero figure in the middle, and see what they say about what it might be to be someone who tries to live in this way, who tries to follow this countercultural way that Jesus and so many of these minor characters, so often the women, so often the gender queer characters in the Bible, like the Ethiopian eunuch and so on, they show us what it is to live in a culture that we're trying to challenge. So I've briefly go through the midwives. Fantastic example of people who have virtually no power or authority. They are part of a slave people. They're women. We learn later, oh, God was nice to them and gave them families. Let's bracket that out for a minute. But we learn later that they haven't got families of their own, and so are, in that culture, considered to be relatively unimportant women. They're doing the kind of job which is a funny sort of job. It's a bit like being an undertaker or something. You know, you're there on the boundaries of life and death, and dealing with quite messy stuff, getting covered in bodily fluids and so on. And so you're kind of feared and slightly on the edges of society, as well as actually being really needed and important to that society. So they are people who are quite marginalised in all sorts of ways, but who are comfortable in that liminal space that other people aren't comfortable in. And they are told by the king, who has all the situational power you could possibly have. You know, he's the king. He's a man. He's rich. He's the owner of all these subject people. They're told to do something, and they simply don't do it. And they use the power they've got, which is to be in a situation that these people who say they've got the power are not prepared to enter into. It's a women's space, it's a messy space, and they're the people who are in there, and so they can disobey that instruction. They use it to subvert that hierarchical power that Pharaoh is imposing on them. And then there's that wonderful scene where they're standing up in front of him and he's saying, "Why haven't you done it?" And they just go, "Oh, they're just too strong. You know, just give birth before we get there. What can we do?" And of course, he can't really argue with that. So there's a fantastic example there about taking what power you have got in a situation, even when it seems like virtually none, and just doing what you can in that situation. They can't control whether he goes and kills the children later, but they can do what they can do in that moment. And they can choose not to let their fear of this person who actually has all the hierarchical power affect their particular actions. Similarly, although rather more painfully to hear, there's the mother in this story. She's not named. Moses' mother, who provides, again, this passive resistance. All she can do is keep this baby alive for 3 months. And reading that as a mother, you do think, God, the terror you can imagine of every little cry and having to kind of stifle it, and absolutely terrifying. And it's only for the first 3 months that she can manage to do it. After that, he's too big, he's too noisy, she just can't keep him hidden any longer. And so she does the only thing she can do. He'll probably die, he'll probably be killed, but all she can do is put him somewhere where he's safe for now and hope. It's not a kind of, she's a marvellous example of faith because she knew God would save him. There is none of that in the story. She is probably assuming he's going to die, and there's echoes of the story of Hagar saying, I just don't want to see this child die because that will be too painful. But she does the only thing she can do. She can keep him alive as long as she can, and then she can just put him somewhere and hope. Set him adrift and hope. So she has less chance of that making a difference, and yet, of course, in the story, that's a hugely important thing. So an example, I think, of even when everything seems hopeless, just do the only thing it is possible to do. And then the wonderful example, one of my favourite characters, is Moses' sister in this story, Miriam. Miriam, we don't know how old she is. We know she's older than Moses, so I always kind of imagine her maybe about kind of 7, 8, 9, but she could have been 14, 15. It's hard to tell. But she's described as his sister, not as a sort of woman in her own right. And Moses, Aaron and Miriam do quite a lot together later. She goes on to be a prophet. She takes on this role of attentiveness. The mother can't bear to see what's going to happen to this baby. Miriam takes it on herself to sit and hide and watch. It's incredibly difficult to just watch in a situation where you have no power and just see what happens. And she's ready to step in at what seems to her like just the right moment and say something. And what she says is this incredibly audacious suggestion. Oh, would you like me to go and find a wet nurse for that baby? And off she goes and manages to arrange things so that not only does Moses go back to his actual mother, but she gets paid for it. It's brilliant. So what Miriam does is she sits and watches and waits, and then at the point where she thinks, actually a word from me could make a difference, it's risky and I'm putting my neck out there, but I'll try it, she says what seems to be a ridiculously audacious thing to do, shooting for the sky, and it works. So speaking audaciously to power, seizing the opportunity and being attentive and waiting for that right moment. And then there's the Hebrew princess. Now for years I focused on the other women and never actually noticed the princess. And it's taken me a while to unpack why. I think maybe the Hebrew princess is such a kind of girly figure in my imagination. In all those stories of Moses, she's there in her beautiful pink sari, bending. I don't think Egyptian people actually wore saris at that point, but in all the pictures from my childhood, that's what she was wearing. Bending over the river, being all maternal. And I think, accusing myself here, I actually slightly dismissed her from being an important character in the story because she was too overtly feminine. But actually, she's very interesting. She, again, notices. Now, I mean, that's quite natural. There's a basket floating in the river. You think, oh, what's in the basket in the river? We'd all do that. Notice that later the baby's crying, though. So you do wonder whether her attention was drawn to the basket because the baby was already crying. So maybe there was already a sense that, is there a kitten or a baby or something in that basket? Something alive, perhaps, that she's drawn to. But she actually is very courageous. She disregards her class and national, her race interest, her privileged position, and allows compassion for someone who is obviously, and she knows from one glance, is a member of this other race. She knows that this child should have been killed, and she disobeys that rule out of compassion for the child. Now, I don't know. There are two different alternatives going on in my head here. Was she thinking, oh, poor baby, he's so cute, I'll look after him? Was she thinking, actually, my father, 3 alternatives, actually, my father is an evil git, and he's trying to kill all these children, and this is awful, and I'm going to do what I can to save at least this one? Or was she possibly actually really desperately wanting a child? If you're a princess, you often don't get to marry who you want to. You don't get to necessarily have children. There could be umpteen princesses who weren't allowed to marry because that didn't suit their father's dynastic interests. And she might have been desperate for children of her own. And this was the only way she could possibly get one. We don't know. We're not told that. But for whatever reason, whether it's the kind of motherly compassion that tends to be what's focused on, or whether it's her own self-interest, or whether it's a sort of generic humanitarian interest that there is a child here that she can save, she intervenes and uses the racial and class privilege that she has and kind of works her femininity, because it's acceptable and has generally been acceptable in most societies for a woman to coo over a baby. And she, presumably when she goes back and tells Dad what she's done, she must have worked that, oh, this beautiful little baby, I want a baby, Daddy. She works those feminine gender norms in her favour, and in the favour of this baby and this whole family, and in the context of the story, the entire people of God. And that's an example, it seems to me, of how, when you look at the women in the Bible, and the woman in Mark is the same, they always subvert the gender roles they're meant to have. I find it unbelievable when people look at the Bible and say this biblical ideal of womanhood, or this biblical ideal of sexual ethics, or whatever. There isn't a single woman in the Bible who conforms to the gender stereotypes or the rules that they're meant to conform to. They are all subverting. If you read the Bible looking at the women, what you see is an absolute mandate, an instruction, and a kind of manual of subversive hints and tips on how to do it, in how to subvert oppressive regimes and begin to overturn them using whatever little bits of power you have. And that's why I find it, despite all its problems, despite the fact that it's been used as a patriarchal and hierarchical symbol and text in so many ways over so many centuries, still actually fundamentally a really, really inspiring book, and something that motivates me to want to go, yeah, actually, we can do this. We can change the world. And I think you're going to be a great group of people to get on with changing the world with. Amen.